I'm beginning with a square-headed brush because it has a fairly wide surface area. I can apply a lot and hold a good amount of paint. And this first layer, I'm going to work on it while it's still wet, but I'm going to make it very thin so I don't end up with any real muddy areas. So I'm just kind of taking the paint and scraping it in. Now, even though we're working on the shadow side of this painting, the top portion will still be a little bit brighter. And so as we get down into the bottom, I'm using a little bit of a darker tone. And we'll scrape that in as well. Now, although I'm scraping, I'm still trying to stay either in a horizontal or a vertical movement with my brush. Because a lot of these mountains, I think generally we think of them on angles, right? But a lot of them are comprised of little square shelving pieces kind of stacked on top of each other, almost like very organic stairs. And so for that reason, I'm just trying to keep my brush movements in those general directions. Something else to note while we're working on the darker half of this is that I'm trying to make sure that I'm creating little ledges, and I'm making sure none of them are ever the same as ones I've previously created. I'm creating different strokes vertically and horizontally. I'm ensuring that these ledges are all going to be very different from one another. Now that I've applied all of my darks, we're kind of left with something that looks like a giant mess. However, that's how it's intended to look at this point. Again, the paint's supposed to be very thin, and it's almost like just doing a drawing in two tones. I'm applying all of these highlights to the brighter areas of my mountain. And again, I'm still just working slowly. I'm not really trying to scrape the paint in as well. Instead, I'm just kind of applying it and then very softly blending it in one way or the other. I just don't want it to have a harsh aesthetic. I do want to also take a lot of the saturation out of the darks. So once I get three areas that are fairly close, I'll just do very soft blends over the darker tones. Now that we've made a lot of it much more soft, I'm actually going to go in and reincorporate a lot of the detail using this color for my darks. I'm going to apply this over all of my lights. So we're going to reincorporate some of that detail we initially created when we drew it out. So I'm using my small square-headed brush still, because again, you don't want anything too large. So there you can see where I'm applying some of my oranges. Let's apply some of the darker colors yet again. Doing it very minimally to begin with. You don't want to do too much too quickly. And at the same time, I don't want to reincorporate too much contrast. We softened the values for a reason. Let's just add back in that important detail. Here, going back to some orange. Taking my time to select sometimes. Sometimes we see things very quickly and it's very intuitive, very cathartic. But sometimes we also need to step back and just be very pragmatic with where we're applying it, why we're applying it in each area. And remembering that, again, we don't want to make two areas look too similar. It's all meant to be different. And that's what we're doing. We're making it different, and that's making it interesting. So here, I'm just beginning with a mixture of lemon yellow, cad yellow, yellow ochre, and a little bit of titanium white. And I'm actually just going to apply it to the entirety of the bright side. Once I have all of this down, then I can feel confident about incorporating some of the shadows. And the shadows are going to be made out of these same colors that we used over here. I'd also like to note that this yellow is much brighter than I'm going to want it to be in the end. And we can use a darker orange that we used in here as a nice little dividing area. Again, I don't want it to go straight up. I'm going to use it in portions because I want it to remain interesting and different. But it's something we can definitely incorporate to help. Because again, it's in both colors and it's going to make it very cohesive. But now that we have a good base, a good footing, I'm going to begin to incorporate different things, such as that. We'll just blend that out in different ways. So here again, I've just put on that dark base that I did initially over there. I'm taking my lighter color. I'm going around the edges primarily. And then I'm just blending in yet again. Now this has a lot of white in it, so again the intent is to kind of gray down this tone. And then later we go back in and add the details. Then take oranges, put them on the brighter side, make them kind of that mix between the yellow and the darker color, which again I feel like it looks like a purple, but really it's just a very desaturated darker orange. A lot of little processes, but if you follow them, it works. And I think throughout a lot of them, it doesn't look fantastic and you really doubt yourself and how you're rendering it, but it's meant to look like that. It's not meant to look perfect halfway through. And this isn't even really meant to look perfect. It's going to look a lot better once we do the sky and everything else, because then I'll know how to adjust that to the rest of the painting. So, don't quit early or feel like you're doing a bad job. Continue, learn, grow, and eventually you'll end up with something you're probably quite happy with. It just takes time, it takes practice, and it takes different layering. Because we are doing all of this layering in oils, you should really make sure that you aren't applying too much too early. Again, I was really scraping it in on the initial layers because we can easily get too much applied and then you don't really have much control over your value or saturation of different colors. Now I'm going to continue my mountain range both to the left and the right of the painting. However, we do have a large portion down here. And I began these top portions with a very small square-headed brush. But down here, I don't want as much detail. I want the eye to kind of get lost here and come back up down, or come back up here. So I'm going to do that by using a larger square-headed brush. And I'm going to essentially do the same thing, but I'm going to use a little bit more orange and I'm going to ensure that it's fairly dark. So here, I'm just taking a little bit of black. I'll blend it on the canvas just so it's a lot easier to see and understand. I'm taking some orange hue, and then I'll also take a bit of white because again, I don't want a straight black on the canvas. So now, I'm just kind of blending it out. And as we get farther down, I think I might have said I wanted to incorporate more orange, but I might want to incorporate a little bit more of a bluer black, because again, we are mixing our black here with orange hue and French ultramarine blue. I might want it to get cooler as we move down the painting. So I'm actually going to take a little bit of French ultramarine blue. That's a lot. We all make mistakes. So I'm really going to spread that out, blend it down. That's probably all I want for the entirety of this. And then I'm going to go back to using that black, that orange hue, and all of that. I'm creating sharp edges by pressing the brush into the canvas and then leading in a direction. And then this side is obviously much more feathered, which I can just branch off and do whatever I want with. Again, because this area, I don't want it to have too much attention, I'm being much more loose with it. So you'll see me moving much more in varying directions, as opposed to the control that we initially had with the top of the painting. And I'm taking a lot of it as well and I'm blending it back upwards. Because it is a slightly different color I want them to blend fairly naturally. Now also, it's much more orange right here than anywhere else. And I did that because the light's coming through, it's really hitting the top of these mountains, but then light's being reflected and bounced in between and around them. And so you're not going to get direct sunlight, that's that really warm color, but you're going to get much more of a bright version of the mountains. And that's why we go from a yellow down to an orange down here. And as you get farther down, maybe we're going to move to more of a blue because you get the shadows reflecting upon each other as opposed to the highlights. Nothing's really finished. It's all waiting and dependent upon other portions of the painting, which makes it interesting, because it's always evolving. Now that I have the majority of these larger mountains blocked in, I need to work on these ones. However, to do that, I need to make them a mixture of the colors here and the colors in the sky. Now, because I haven't done the sky yet, and I don't know exactly what colors I'm going to settle on with it, I think I need to do the sky first. So we're going to put that in the back, we're going to work on it later, we're going to work on the sky now. I'm going to begin in the sky by doing two things. One, applying some white. Two, applying some black. Now, this is going to make a gray sky, and I don't want a gray sky. However, what this is going to do, it's going to give me a very thin base because I'm going to very much scrape all of the paint in. That way, again, it doesn't get muddy later on and these colors don't overtake everything else. But I want to ensure that I get the value of everything correct first. Now that I have a base of gray, I'm going to begin by taking light blues and scraping that on across the top. I'm going to take a pink, I'm going to put that throughout the middle, and then I'm going to take a very beige yellow, and that's going to primarily be around the base. Now, I don't want to put the yellow and the blue right beside each other because they'll mix to make a green right here in the middle. But by incorporating this very neutral pink tone right in the middle where they'll meet, we'll never make that green. It'll look like a smooth transition from one to the other. And another thing to note, this yellow doesn't really look that yellow. The blue doesn't look very blue. And it's all intended to look very muted because, again, we don't want the sky to take away from our main places where we want our eye to go. So I'm being fairly loose with it. Also, I'm using this very small brush because it creates little details and movements within a sky. If I were to use a very large mop brush and just work on it and finish it 30 seconds, it would be done. It'd be very smooth, but it wouldn't have a lot of character. It wouldn't have any movement. You wouldn't see any brush strokes. And I really like brush strokes in paintings. And as everything kind of gets lost in the view. So again, I'm beginning with my horizontal and vertical strokes of the brush. Just kind of blending everything together, just the way we did in the foreground. Which means I also take orange as a transitionary color. Apply all of that here. And again, just keep blending, moving everything around. That orange is far too saturated though. So I'm going to take a little bit of black, a little bit of white, and just go over it. Nice and easy. Now I'm going to work on some very soft, subtle fog down here. And something to note about fog, the color should be a combination of whatever you see in the sky, the light, and whatever environments around it. So here, I'm taking the yellow that we actually used in the sky, and I'm applying that. So much like our other layering and our sky, our rocks, starting with a very thin layer where I'm just scraping paint into the canvas. Now this It's going to look very simple initially, but then we're going to draw rocks back down into it very slightly. And we might get some reflections from the blue sky in it. We might get some orange reflections. And we'll just begin to elaborate on it. This is kind of, maybe it's a cloud running through because these are very high. Maybe it's fog. You know, it could be a number of different things. But in all of those scenarios, the coloring is going to be very reactive to the environment and everything around it. It looks very simple at this point, nice and soft. And then I'm going to begin to run it up our mountains very minorly. Start to combine our colors. And there you can see it's darkening it right here, which is actually what we want. Because we don't want it initially to just get very dark, very bright. We want that transition. We want to know that they are transparent and they are working over top of our mountain range. There we go. And I'm doing a lot of this in circular motions with the brush. I'm also not holding it like that. I'm trying to give it a lot of movement, and I'm trying to feel very not constrained. I'm also not just making the same C shape over and over. Sometimes they're large, sometimes they're small. Sometimes they're long, sometimes they're much more wide. Trying to build diversity in strokes and styles. Taking my darker colors from there, brushing them back over here. When you add fog, you can run into the issue of simplifying areas too much, and so I'm actually going to take a paper towel here. I'm going to scrape off paint where I'm going to want to re-add in a couple of mountains. Not much, I don't want to do too much, and they're just going to be kind of peeking out right here. The idea is not to completely take away these, and it's not to overcomplicate it. It is just to find a decent balance where both of them look quite good together. Now, something to note, this rock formation, it's going to be slightly closer than these, and so value-wise, it's going to be a little bit darker, and it's going to be a little bit sharper. As I get closer to the bottom, I'm going to want it to blend into the fog, so it's going to need to dissipate, but as I get closer to the top, it's going to be much sharper, and it's going to have a higher contrast because it isn't engulfed at all by its surroundings. Also, don't try to make a flat line when it's sticking out. Make sure that one level is here, the next one's a lot lower or a lot higher. Just make sure that in terms of height, it's always changing, and that way it's very interesting. Now I'm going to go in with that brighter tone that I have. I'm going to work it around the edges and just kind of hope it works at this point. If not, we can fix it. There we go. Applying the orange makes adding the yellow much easier, especially because we already had the more pinkish aesthetic. If we were to add the yellow over that, we definitely get something pink. But because we have the orange as a little base, you get much more of that natural yellow tone that I really wanted. There we are. Now I'm painting the next set of mountains over here. Again, they're going to be very similar to those, but they're going to be a little bit darker so that I can really accentuate the light on the tree and ensure that it stands out from the background. But aside from that, this mountain range here, it's going to be done in the exact same way that I did that over there. So I'm going to quickly work through this, and then I will see you on this portion of the painting. However, this is my first video formatted this way. So I'm curious, in future videos, although I've already explained how I did those mountains, do you want me to do that again right here? Just go over it again. I know that sometimes I learn best when I hear something 100 times. and maybe you just want to go back and listen to those portions again. But it's just a thought. Now I'm going to begin working on all of these little intricate tree trunk pieces. I'm going to begin with the same square-headed brush that I used in the mountains and the sky. And I'm going to think about where the light's coming from. It's coming from that way down. So primarily this side of the tree is going to be bright, that side is going to be darker. However, the light will wrap around and get both edges. Something else to note about doing this, a lot of the leaves are going to cast shadows upon these branches. And because of that, they're going to be darker than areas perhaps down here. Because we haven't done the leaves yet, we can't be exact with what we're doing, but we can get a pretty good idea and a good guess from there. So with all of that being said, here I'm just beginning to apply my darker tone first, and I'm being fairly liberal with my application. I'm not scraping it in as much because this is the foreground, and although I'm going to want to change the color, trees are naturally fairly gray. And because of that, if I make the paint a little bit muddy because I'm using an excess, that's alright, because the muddy color will probably match what I want a tree to be anyway. Also, because it's in the foreground, I want it to have a little bit more of a texture than in the background. In the backgrounds, I like to paint with much more thin layers, and then as we move forward, we get a higher value, saturation, contrast, and increasing amounts of actual pigment on the painting. So from there, I'm going to take my smaller brush, it's again a square-headed brush. I'm going to work around the edges with some of my warmer tone. Now as you can see, in comparison to the sky and everything else, this doesn't really stand out. So I might want to use a slightly brighter mix on top of this a little bit later. But just for beginning, I'm quite satisfied with this tone. I'm also going to take the gray that we mixed, and in some areas, especially in between, I'm going to begin applying that as well. We're just going to start blending the three of them together, but still keeping that contrast. This brush is really nice because it's creating a lot of little strokes, and said strokes are creating detail. I'm not making the painting flat, I'm ensuring I keep the texture of the brush stroke itself. Now I'm just working on dabbing all of these little intricate details in there, and I'm predominantly just using this very bright color that we used previously in the mountains. So what I'm doing with this, I have it on my square-headed brush, and then I'm just doing a little tap, and I'm not pushing the brush into the actual canvas, I'm just letting the pigment touch more pigment. If I were to rub it in, this color would mix with the color below it, and that's not my intent. I want this actual color directly applied to the canvas. And that's easily achieved when you're just very delicate and light. It means you can't blend it, and it also means that you frequently have to go back to your palette and grab more, because it does run out on your brush when you do it this way. But it's a way to create a lot of really intricate detail in a small area. And it really stands out because, again, it's not blending, it is a fairly hard stroke, and it's also going to be textured, which will make it further stand out. You don't want to do too much, and again, I'm not going to do this as I get up and higher in the tree because the foliage is going to block it, but down here where the light will be hitting it, it can really add some nice accents to the painting itself. And they don't have to all just be on the edge. Again, some of them can be a little bit more in because pieces of the tree will be jetting out. I want each piece of the bark to look different from the next. I don't want to paint them all in the same technique, and this is an easy way of doing it. Just ensuring using a very small brush to the point where creating something that would look exactly the same as something else is almost impossible, because you have to make so many strokes to render what you are. And again, some of it should be on the other side of the tree as well. Not too much. I'm also softening a lot of the edges with a very light stroke, because I don't want this tree to feel like it was cut out and taped on here. So I need to ensure that it blends very minorly. Just another little thought. Now, in regards to working on these higher branches, I'm making them a lot smaller as they move upwards, and I'm trying to instigate both round movements and sharp movements. Generally, when we begin drawing trees and painting them, we'll make everything kind of in a snake shape. It's all fairly even moving, and a lot of the limbs are the same length. So here, what I'd really implore you to do is to make sure that all of these limbs are different lengths than the other ones. Also, make little V's inside as opposed to making them all a C shape. Have hard turns and soft turns. Together, you can render a really interesting tree. And if you just have one of them, it can look kind of boring. Most trees are complex, and so you should treat them in a similar fashion, much like this. Another thing to note about working up here, as opposed to down here, we mentioned it prior, but I'm making sure I'm using a lot darker of a pigment, because the light that's coming from that side, it's going to be blocked by a lot of leaves and foliage, and other branches even. So these ones right here are going to be progressively darker as we get higher up. And I'm not applying too much paint at this point, because I know I'm going to be covering up a good portion of them with foliage and leaves later on. So it's one of those things that you want to work on kind of hesitantly in regards to paint application, especially if you haven't already put down the foliage first. You could have put down all of the leaves, or I could have, and then worked the branches in and around them. But I somehow feel it's more natural to paint the tree almost like it's winter, and then I add on top of it later on. Things like that will probably, for the most part, be covered up. But just to understand the structure and how all the leaves are going to be facing can be quite imperative. So that's just another little tip for painting trees. And hopefully you feel like it's a natural progression going up. There isn't a large part and then a small part. There's a transitional area. And sometimes trees do get a little bit larger again. You know, they'll get smaller and then they might get a little bit larger, provided the weight can be supported. So it's just another little thing to consider when doing all of this. Now that I've finished predominantly a lot of my branches, and I will go back and add highlights to ones that I think really need to stand out, I'm going in and I'm working on my foliage. I'm starting with a very dark green. I'm using a larger brush because I don't want this to look very detailed initially, at least not in my first very dark layer. And I'm just working around branches where I feel like I can apply a lot of foliage. I'm kind of working and ensuring that I'm softening the edges as I'm doing so. I don't want that to get out of control. I'm also not just filling in all of the orange, because I know that I will want additional sky in varying areas of it too. So I'm keeping that in mind, and I'm just applying the foliage where I want it to be. And as you can see, I'm dragging the paint outwards, I'm not scraping it back and forth, because I do want the edge to be nice and soft, and I don't want too much of a blend from the blue to this green. And for the record, this green is simply a mixture of my black, a titanium white, very minorly, and a yellow ochre. So I'm not actually using a green pigment. Generally, I like to mix my greens out of yellows and darker pigments. Not a fan of just straight greens. Here, I'm just trying to create different layers of foliage. Maybe that's very far back. This is up close. Again, scraping towards the sky. Reapplying here, and then scrape. Now here, I'm just adding little highlights to the edges of a couple of the branches, predominantly where the sun will hit on the far right side. I'm using the same warm color that I used in the bottom tree and in the mountains, and I'm actually using the same technique that I used on the tree as well. It's just this very minor little tapping motion, and it's not even blending. I'm just applying the paint on top, very small, very lightly. Sometimes I'll apply too much, like right there, and so I will do a little bit of a scrape. I'll just get rid of that. So here, we're just really adding all of the minute details. Now, it's definitely something that's really easy to do too much of. And I might even have too much right there, I'm not sure. It's easy to fix though, so don't really worry about it. But, you know, explore, try things. Maybe you like a lot more than I do, maybe you like less. And in fact, this might be a little bit too bright, so I might go in and kind of soften it, darken it, just very softly. Run my brush over top. Not to the point of removing it, but just giving it a very slight blend with the rest of the painting. Now, I don't want to paint every little piece, but moving around, doing a couple really works. And by having these sharp little textured pieces, followed by the thick layering middle, and then the blended edges, it gives it almost 3 layers of depth. And that way, and you can definitely do more, but this way we're just ensuring that there's a lot going on. It's interesting and it exists within a nice 3D world. Now, the tapping effect that we instilled in all of the highlights is not only limited to the highlights, because for the larger portion of the tree, I was using this brush to apply paint, and now I'm going back in with that same small brush that I used to apply the highlights, and I'm just kind of applying it over all of my dark and negative space. What this is doing, it's creating the same pattern and consistency of the highlights, so everything in the foreground feels cohesive. I'm not doing it in the background areas and in the areas that are meant to be farther away, but all of the shadow areas are definitely receiving the same treatment as the highlighted areas. And of course with this, I'm going to be doing much more so than I did with the highlights. I didn't want the highlights to take over the tree. However, shadows are definitely an integral part. And so you can really explore with them in that regard. And don't make all of your shadows the same tone or color. You notice how they progressively change throughout this tree. The more of a discernible change you can create, the more realistic your tree will look. Now I'm just applying fog running through this little tree path area. I'm using the same colors that I used over there, which is predominantly in orange. I'm just slightly dabbing with this small brush, making very minute changes. These rocks were all completed in the same way that the ones above were, except I kept a little bit more saturation in the color, because again, they are closer. And the foliage was completed in the same way that the tree above was. So really we're just doing a lot more of the same, but up close with a little bit more detail.
There we have it.
I truly hope you've enjoyed, and again, if you have any questions or inquiries regarding today's painting, I implore you to leave me a comment in the comment section down below. I'd be more than happy to attend to it and help you in any way that I can. Now, all of that being said, if you've enjoyed today's video, if perhaps you'd like to see more, then I'd implore you to hit that subscribe button and consider signing up for my weekly newsletter. Upon signing up for that, I will send you a free real-time painting tutorial of a winter cardinal, and in addition, every Saturday I will also send you an update email including all of the videos that I've released from the past week and also tips and tricks. On a similar note, if perhaps you'd just like to see what I'm doing, stay up to date, see my work, and perhaps even send me a message, you can find me over on facebook.com. Now, all of that being said, again, I truly hope you've enjoyed. My name's Ryan O'Rourke. I hope to see you next Saturday, and above all, stay creative.